Steph, I know you were rocking some very cool SOAR kit at Two Oceans recently, which I'm assuming now is your lucky race kit. But talk to me a little bit about why you chose to race in SOAR.
I just love the quality of SOAR kit. It's so light and breathable that you forget you're wearing it, which when you're racing is very important because it's one less distraction and you want to be feeling your best on race day. My favourite item though has to be the marathon shorts. There are so many places that you can store your gels and other items without it feeling bulky. They're just so comfortable to do those long runs in. There's a huge range of performance kit in really cool colours and designs that you can check out at soarrunning.com. For some spring training motivation, SOAR are rewarding you for hard-earned personal bests whilst wearing a SOAR race vest. Run a verified PB between the 1st of March and the 31st of May and get £50 SOAR credit. Head to the show notes for details.
Thank you to SOAR for sponsoring this episode.
I certainly had an absolute phobia of talking about periods, couldn't talk about blood. Exercising females, and particularly those who are loading their body, are more susceptible to iron deficiency than the general population. Our research in football has found that in that premenstrual phase, you're 6 times more likely to get a muscle injury.
On today's episode, we're going to be joined by a leader in female athlete health and an expert on how our hormones and blood iron levels can affect our performance.
Along with a PhD from University College London, Dr. Georgie Brunvels is co-founder of Fitter Women, a programme and app which helps guide athletes and coaches to optimise their training and recovery around their menstrual cycle.
Steph, I think we just want to start this episode with saying that this is not just for female athletes. Men, do not turn off right now. This is for you too. It's so important that everyone understands how different our physiology is, how individual we are. And I think for a long time, women have just trained very much the same as men. And that comes from a lack of understanding in coaches and just a general lack of understanding of physiology. I think it's only now, after years and years of research, that we're understanding how individual our physiology is. And that's something that Georgie gets across so well in this episode. And that by understanding that, we can use it to our strengths to train and perform better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's being hammered home more and more now that women aren't small men. And most research in the past has been carried out on men. So it's only right that I guess women were following the research without realising it's not been tested on us as well. So as you said, Georgie really does highlight how now that testing's been done on women too, just how different we are. And I think what's so interesting is how we can really optimise the different stages of our menstrual cycles to perform at our best at any time of the month. Whereas I do think it's a case where, you know, people struggle at certain times of the month, but it's good to know we don't have to.
Yeah, and it's also just so helpful to understand why, rather than just, as you say, accepting it and being like, well, I'm not going to perform as well. Actually learning that you can perform just as well at any stage just by understanding what's going on at a physiological level and then being able to adapt training, nutrition, recovery, all those elements to get the best from ourselves. But again, this is another thing that just seems to have been much more of an open conversation over the last couple of years. I think previously the menstrual cycle has been this like weird taboo subject, which is bizarre given that half the population has one. And it's obviously natural and, as Georgie says, healthy. But it's just so great that this conversation is opening up and we're understanding more and more about menstrual cycles and how we can use them to train at our absolute best.
Yeah, and I think it's just so important that we feel open to talk about it, especially as athletes where we may have male coaches, not feeling embarrassed about the fact you have a period. Like you say, half the population has one. It's not weird. So just kind of breaking down those barriers and feeling comfortable to talk about it to anyone is super important. And another key thing that I think we both took away from this episode was learning about iron levels and the importance of having the optimal iron level, because it can easily happen both ways, where you're low on iron for various reasons, but you can also be too high on iron, which is really interesting because I think maybe people aren't aware of that because that comes with negative side effects. But this is quite relevant for you at the moment because you'll be training at altitude soon as part of your training for Paris. So are there any measures that you take to make sure that your iron levels are at the right place to be training at altitude, because we know that is even more important when there's less oxygen?
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, when you go to altitude, it's really important to make sure that your iron is at the upper end of what's normal for you. So I do normally get an iron test about 4 weeks out so that I can make any changes that I need to before going to altitude and make sure that I'm in a good place to go there and train. But actually this chat with Georgie came at such a good time, because what I didn't quite realise was that I needed to check more than just ferritin. And without spoiling the whole episode, there is more to iron testing than just ferritin testing. And that was a really important point for me. And I think, again, just one of those things that has perhaps been oversimplified a bit. And it is a bit more complicated than just taking an iron tablet and hoping for the best. So I'm definitely going to be dialing more into my iron levels, especially around altitude training trips.
Yeah, definitely very good knowledge to have. And I think there are so many takeaways that people are going to get from this episode. So shall we crack on?
Let's do it. Georgie, thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. We cannot wait to dive into this topic, which I know we're just going to learn so much about today. But our first question, which we ask all our guests, is what is your why for running?
Ooh, that's such a good place to start. Okay, so I think my why's actually changed. So I think when I was younger, I was just super competitive, but also I needed to like expend energy in some way. I played lots of different sports when I was a kid, but I think running particularly meant that like I was in control of how I was going to do. So it wasn't me necessarily relying on teammates. I was the master of my own destiny, I guess. But as I've got older, like honestly, and I think having a full-time job and I guess a relatively busy life, as we all have really, I think for me, running is more than just like wanting to win and wanting to achieve, which for sure I still feel like I really, really have. But I think it's like the headspace of it, just like being able to see places. Like I get to travel quite a lot with my work and you just get the most amazing opportunity to see the world. And I think I always find it so funny if, say, last year I was in Australia and all of my colleagues would be, I don't know, getting up at a normal time and we come down to breakfast and I would have already run like, I don't know, 10 miles, 11 miles, whatever, and seen so much of Australia and they've just seen their bedrooms. And I love the way that you can explore the world, but also just get some perspective, get some headspace, clear your mind.
Yeah.
I love that. I know, Steph, you can 100% relate to that. Travel bug over here and just runs everywhere she goes.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it's the best way to just explore a new place. And I agree. You know, you have people that then want to go sightseeing in the day and I'm like, I've seen it all already.
Totally,
and you get your bearings of a place so quickly. You're just like, I know this city that I've been in one day. But yeah, I love that. And also what you said about you having a why when you were younger and it's kind of changed. I think we're hearing that more and more with our guests now. It's actually, you can have multiple whys and it kind of evolves through your running career, but always being able to go back to those original ones as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think even within like a season or within a year, like different races have different whys. And I think I've always, again, like when I was younger and I think in one of my former training groups, to me, every time you stood on the start line, it was all about who is going to win on that day, who is the best. But now I think I have so much more understanding of on any one day, everyone's in a slightly different place and has a different aim and different goals. And you just have to be respectful of that. And also, like, it helps you manage your own internal expectation as well.
Okay, so with this episode, firstly, we want to know why both male and female listeners should listen to this topic before we get into it.
Such a good question. Okay, so first thing, there's 3.95 billion women out there, equal number of men, pretty much. And I think for so long, or really historically, full stop, those 3.95 billion women have been treated like men in an effect. So whether it's like the temperature of a room, whether it's the design of seatbelts, whether it's the design of airbags, whether it's medication advice, like all of that is based on male physiology and male anatomy. There's many reasons for that I won't bore you with too much, apart from the fact that females are just more challenging to do research on. And it was assumed for so long that effectively females were just males with a uterus. But now we know, obviously, they're really not, which is a massive passion of mine. But in essence, really because of all of this lack of understanding, it means that we're so polarized and biased in our kind of stereotyping, but also our understanding of how to support females and also for females, how they should look after themselves. And I really believe that like globally, everyone needs to have an understanding of actually how people think, how people feel, etc. And for males out there who potentially have a female partner or who are coaching females, which actually we know many males do coach females, having a better understanding of this and just from a real life perspective is just so important in terms of supporting half of the population to get the most out of themselves and just understand themselves as well, especially when we're in the midst of a mental health crisis, like obesity crisis, all of these things. We need to actually understand how to support females, but just generally understand females.
When you put it like that, it just seems crazy that it's taken us this long to identify that females are not just males with a slight genetical twist. And actually, especially from a performance perspective, of course, we're going to perform differently and our bodies work so differently. It is crazy that it's taken us this long to get to that point. But you've been working in this area for 10 years. And I think 10 years ago, the last 10 years, we have progressed a lot. So back then it must have been even more, what you were doing was totally groundbreaking. But what got you interested in this area of female hormones, how we work in performance, and also iron deficiency, because you, of course, have your PhD in that?
Yes, that is such a good question. I do feel firstly that I've been super lucky in terms of the timing of like literally when I started my PhD, Heather Watson, the tennis player, said that her menstrual cycle caused her to not do well at the Australian Open. And I felt like I was very lucky to kind of harness that and the news and the media around that real negative headline to then say, hang on, world, we need to wake up and listen. And I absolutely don't think I'm necessarily been at the fore of it, but I feel like I've been lucky to be involved in it from sort of the outset of people thinking about this. But I would say that for me, in terms of like personal interests, so many things, like I think growing up, for sure, I competed in some team sports where they were female only, but also some individual sports, so running, but also swimming. And I vividly remember, particularly swimming, so I was swimming more at this time, being able to kind of keep up with the boys up until when I was about 11. And then suddenly they just got really good. And I was like, I just don't understand this. And then I remember one of my best friend's brothers joined us for training one day, running wise. This is when I started running more. And it's actually Amelia Goretzka, you might remember her. Her brother came along and started training with us, and he was good. And then just like within a few weeks, he was absolutely smashing us. And I was like, I don't understand. Like, he was right with us, and he's a couple of years younger than me and my friends at the time. And it didn't make any sense. And so I think that started like me thinking like, oh, what the hell? But also we never learn about this. Like no one rationalizes it to you. I just remember someone telling me that boys don't produce as much lactic acid as girls. And I was like, what? Like, I don't understand that. I don't think that makes sense.
And at such a young age as well, you don't learn these things, and you're thinking, why am I worse than someone else?
Exactly.
And you can make it so simple when actually it's so complex.
Exactly. And I think it is really disheartening. And then I think as I got older, I then moved to a different running club. And I remember the boys always got like, I don't know, maybe they do 12K sessions. The girls would do 8K sessions. And I was just like, this is really weird. But at the same time, we were very much kind of treated like the boys, but because I guess they raced longer, it was like, oh, their volume would be a little bit higher. But it used to really frustrate me because I love doing longer stuff. So I was like, the injustice of it isn't right, but there seemed to be no rationale. Anyway, then I guess like time evolved and I started doing more work around physiology, did a degree in physiology, absolutely loved it. And I started working in a lab and helped some of my friends on the treadmill, like doing some monitoring, etc. And I guess I would notice they would talk a lot about, oh, I'm like bleeding really heavy right now, or talk about their periods. And to me, that was also a trigger of like, oh, like this is weird. Like, I don't really understand what's going on here. No one talks about this. I certainly had an absolute phobia of talking about periods, couldn't talk about blood. Like when I say blood, it was like, I'm not squeamish and quite like seeing cuts and that kind of thing. I find it quite interesting, but actual periods, like I would not talk about it. I started super early, was so embarrassed about it. Didn't tell my friends at all. didn't talk about it at school or anything. But then as we were getting older, people were talking about it. And one of my friends in particular always used to say, oh, when I'm on my period, I just feel terrible. And I guess then I was like, what the hell? Like there's something going on here. This isn't right. So yeah, I feel like all of those little things like kind of created this real fascination. But also I would say personally, like I just wanted to do better myself. So I wanted to understand more like how I should support myself. And physiologically, yeah, okay, we were given slightly different volumes to men, but why and what did that mean? And it didn't really make sense. So yeah, and then I think with the iron component particularly, I was really fortunate to join a research group where their focus was on iron status, and actually I took part in a trial with them. We were given some treadmill tests and had our iron status measured, and my iron readings were like wild, like really, really high, which everyone else typically has really, really low iron markers. A lot of people talk about ferritin. We might get into that in a bit, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's the best and most accurate means to measure iron, but my ferritin was crazy high. And I was like, I don't understand this. Like, why everyone else has really low ferritin? So what's going on here? So all of that amassed to me being like, oh my gosh, I really want to study this area. And I guess I got a good opportunity to jump in and do that.
Yeah, that's so cool that you could use those questions you had when you were younger and growing up and almost you create your career out of it, find the answers to it. I think that's really cool. And you spoke about obviously the difference between male and females. Through your research now, as we mentioned, we've got male listeners too. What is the difference between male hormones and female hormones, and how do they affect us generally and our performance as well?
So there's lots of different things to think about here. So different hormones for sure. So males primarily have testosterone as their primary reproductive hormone. Females primarily have estrogen and progesterone. Now females do have some testosterone, males do have some estrogen and progesterone, but I guess the dominating hormones are slightly different. We do also need to consider that obviously males have XY chromosomes, females have XX chromosomes. They cause differences, and also anatomically there are significant differences between males and females. But in terms of the key differences hormonally, so obviously reproductive function generally is different, but also immune function is different. So we've seen recently with COVID, males are more likely to have real adverse reactions to COVID, whereas females seem to be more likely to have long COVID. But also we know that susceptibility to different illnesses actually varies based on your sex. So females are more likely to have like inflammatory type issues like rheumatoid arthritis, whereas males are more likely to have cardiac type problems. And there's a whole host of other things I could go into. We also know that hormones really drive the development of muscle. So actually for males, it's so much easier to build muscle. Females, it's more challenging, but also something which I just think back to, again, when I was a kid, talking about the tilt of the pelvis is so important, because typically it's much harder for females to contract their posterior chain, so like the backs of their legs, so glutes through hamstrings. I remember doing clams or various like squat type things and always been told, oh, you'll feel your glutes, and just thinking, I've just never felt a glute in my life. I don't even know what that is. And then I realised like, oh, it's because like I had a male S&C coach who just hadn't been educated, because no one out there is educated in this area, when actually you need to, I don't know, activate the backs of your legs a little bit better, or maybe you need to shift into a slightly different position to really, really feel that. Then loads of other differences. So metabolically, there's some kind of really important key differences here. So there's a lot of chat around like intermittent fasting or exercising pre-breakfast, for example. Like fine for men, but really quite bad for females, can really impact female hormonal health. So when we talk about having a regular menstrual cycle being super important, also perimenopausally, that time is like really important to nail. If you're exercising fasted or if you're not fueling regularly, that's actually really catastrophic and can cause weight gain, which is obviously the complete opposite of what people are often trying to achieve. There's also differences in brain function. So males typically have better spatial awareness. Females are better at like joining the dots between different things. Also, yeah, as I said, anatomical differences, biomechanical differences that affects injury risk. In essence, females and males just are quite different.
Yeah, there is just so much there. Just to dig a bit more into the menstrual cycle, so I know you've done a ton of work, research published a lot on it. And of course, co-founder of Fitter app and program, which talks a lot about the stages of the menstrual cycle. So you just take us through what those stages are and what we can expect in each stage in terms of what we might need to know in relation to our performance?
Sure. So first thing to say, everyone is unique. So I always have to caveat this here because I don't ever want to be too general. But in essence, when you're on your period, hormones are super low. So they're actually the lowest that they're going to be at any time point in your menstrual cycle. And physiologically, you're most similar to that of a man at that time. People talk about being hormonal, but actually being hormonal is the most rubbish expression for when you're on your period because it's the complete opposite. You're unhormonal, really. So anyway, when you're on your period, typically hormones are low, but hormones have done this big cascade premenstrually to cause you to have a bleed. So hormones have to decrease to cause the bleed to happen. And that decrease in hormones can cause symptoms, which is why people can get menstrual cramps, fatigue, brain fog, nausea, vomiting, headaches, migraines, cravings, all of the above. There's actually over 150 different symptoms. Anyway, that process also causes like a bit of an increase in inflammatory markers. So some people can feel a little bit more fatigued or a little bit more leggy, I guess you could say. But actually, physiologically, when you're on your period, that's actually a great time for many people in terms of performance. Like day one, people might feel a bit rubbish, but from then onwards, typically the body is actually in a relatively stable state. Key things to remember here is that getting nutrition right is super important. The body needs a bit more in the way of carbs. It uses carbs more there. You need to think about your hydration. Some people find it really, really easy to focus in that time, like cognitively. Need to think about iron intake, etc. Anyway, that's stage one, we would say, or phase one. Towards the end of that, the hormone estrogen, so one of, again, the two primary reproductive hormones, that starts to increase. And that increase is associated with an increase in the release of serotonin and dopamine, so like the happy, calming hormones. Often people feel amazing at that time and feel like they've got lots of energy, can recover quicker, etc. Again, through that kind of initial time, carbohydrates are super, super important. And where people can see an extension in their menstrual cycle, so I don't know if normally their cycle's 30 days and then suddenly it goes out to 36, 40 days, often it's that there's a delay in this phase because at the end of this phase, ovulation happens. And if you've got too much stress in your body, this is where typically the extension happens, although we're doing some more research on this at the moment, so watch this space. Anyway, so through this period of time, often people feel like they can bounce from session to session and feel great. Then at the end of this phase, so estrogen increases right to a peak. Then another hormone called luteinizing hormone increases. Now, you don't need to worry too much about that, but that is what drives ovulation. So then ovulation happens typically in the middle of the cycle, and then you move into what we call the luteal phase. So the first half is the follicular phase, second half is the luteal phase, and this kind of starts phase 3, which is I guess not really a nickname, but an easier expression that we use for it. And through this phase, this is where progesterone increases alongside estrogen. So estrogen increases pre-ovulation, then decreases, then increases again in this phase, along with progesterone. Now, progesterone is such a fascinating hormone. It causes your body temperature to increase. It causes your resting heart rate to increase a little bit. So if you're tracking your sleep or if you're tracking any metrics of recovery, you might notice that your resting heart rates increase a little bit and your body temperature has, and your sleep might be a little bit more disrupted. It's super important to make sure you're drinking enough to fuel a little bit more, because actually your metabolic rate increases a little bit here too. Your use of protein increases as well, so a bit more protein. You also have a shorter time point or time frame to get food in after exercise in this window. Anyway, this phase of the menstrual cycle typically lasts around 9 days, and it's super important if you have actually had a fertilization. So if you're pregnant, this is where the body really starts throwing hormones at the fetal developmental process. But if you haven't had a fertilization, then this phase ends after about 9 days and hormones significantly decline, which is then what causes you to have a period. And that hormonal decline phase is like 5-ish days. And this is where you can just be game changing with being proactive. So looking after your body, fueling right, sleeping well, doing all you can to help yourself here can help kind of cushion the blow of the hormonal decline and help reduce symptoms generally.
It's time to thank our sponsor for this episode, Veloforte.
Now, as our listeners will know by now, we are both big fans of using the Veloforte products in our training. And I have to say, say, Steph, I had a really hard session today, and all I could think about in those last couple of reps was having a Malto shake at the end. The cold cinnamon and vanilla shake at the end of a hard session just hits differently.
Oh, it tastes so good, doesn't it? I've been absolutely loving the Energy Chews. They're a great alternative to gels, and I've been using them on those longer runs, especially in my training for Two Oceans. They came in very handy and they're so delicious. I love the apple and cinnamon flavour.
And the best bit is, because Veloforte uses only real food ingredients and nothing artificial, you can trust what you're putting in your body, and it digests so much better to synthetic alternatives.
And you can understand every ingredient on the back, which is not always the case with these types of products.
Thanks to Veloforte for supporting this podcast. And if you would like 30% off the Veloforte products, head to veloforte.com and use the code 5miles at checkout.
There's so much to remember there. So I suppose with the Fitter Woman app, and you saying how everyone's obviously individual as well, how does that then help you track your own cycle and help manage those symptoms, and what sort of tips does it give?
Yeah, and this is such a good question. And honestly, it's like a perennial problem that we've had, because there's research out there for sure saying, do this, eat that, eat the other. But we never want to be, you should do this, you should do that, because I don't know in life what is out there to say that black and white, you do this and this response will happen. So we always need to be really careful to say you might feel like this, you might not feel like that. But what the Fitter Women app lets you do, and there's other apps out there as well, is just track your symptoms and learn more about yourself. And it tries to take the user on a journey, like self-discovery. So, for example, if you report that you've got menstrual cramps, it will then give you information about managing menstrual cramps. And what I would say to anyone out there is like, yes, really appreciating that everyone is different, but also mapping your own cycle to, like, people talk about biohacking your hormones, and I don't know quite about that, because if you're not measuring hormones, you can't necessarily do that. But I would say, like, trying to understand your own unique body is so, so important. And know that actually, let's say you typically struggle on the last day before you start your period. Well, a few days before then, that is when you can make a difference to actually reduce the impact that the hormonal changes can have. And I think my premise always is that anyone needs to be able to perform on any day of their cycle, but it's all about being proactive and prepared, and being, or I guess like gaining a better understanding of yourself to work with your body and not fight against it.
That's such a good point, because of course it's great to be able to tailor our training around our menstrual cycle, but for runners of all ability, we all want to race. And there are going to be times when the race might fall on the day that we don't necessarily want it to. So where that's the case, what can we do? You mentioned being proactive in the days leading up to it to manage the symptoms. What are some of those top tips that you would give someone if they've got a race falling on a day that they're worried about?
Good question. And I really want to make sure that people do appreciate that there is no reason why they can't perform on any day, providing they are proactive. But I think key things like nutrition, for sure. So, for example, it's so interesting, but obviously our body craves things at certain times, often potentially unhealthy things, sweet things, or salty things. But they actually make symptoms worse. So I always say to people, like, often your body's craving things because firstly, your blood sugar levels are more unstable. But also you do need to fuel more at certain times in your cycle. And if you don't meet that demand, then your body starts craving. So often it's actually almost a sign that you aren't quite fueling right for your body at that time. So I would say typically in that premenstrual phase, having 5 to 7, if not 7 to 10 portions of fruit and veg a day is super important, because fruit and vegetables are strong have strong anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. And because the menstrual cycle is this cycle of inflammation, that helps to reduce the inflammation. Also, getting enough fish in your diet. Oily fish is super important. If you don't eat fish, then potentially thinking about an omega supplement, obviously informed sport guys. Also thinking about like nuts and seeds, all really good sources of omega-3s as well. But other things I would say is like fueling regularly through the day, making sure that you're getting your fiber and whole grains in. All of that is important. Also, in terms of managing load, I would say, so I work a lot in team sports, I work a lot in football, and we really do like periodize their training around their cycles, but mindful that everyone has to be on the pitch to be able to train and play on any day, but what they do in the gym is modifiable. So we might say at certain times you kind of consolidate load. So if you're, let's say from a running perspective, you've got a race at the weekend, normally on a Tuesday night, you'd be on the track and then Wednesday you'd be in the gym. Well, if you're in the gym, instead of doing, 10 squats, do 6 and maybe make them slightly lighter, because you'll get the same benefit from a slightly lower load because your body doesn't need as much stimulus at that time. I would also say this is the time where you want to get more sleep or jump in a nice bath or wear your compression tights. Just tick all those boxes. Thinking about things like cherry juice before you go to bed. Just, I would say, like bringing your A game to everything you're doing, hydrating super well as well. There are so many tips and tricks, which I also think can be quite overwhelming, but again, appreciating that everyone is so unique and different. And so working out what works for you is really key.
And what about the cramping? Because I know that's something that a lot of women really struggle with. And I remember actually Dina Asher-Smith, I can't remember which race it was, but it was a really important one. And she got cramping during 100 meters, which just was, obviously you don't have the time to recover from that. So it happens at all levels of sport, but what is there anything in particular that you can do to manage that?
And so you mean menstrual cramps specifically? Yeah. So menstrual cramps are super fascinating because what happens when those hormones decline, there's this upregulation of inflammatory markers. Also, these things are called prostaglandins. Now, they're hormone-like substances that basically cause this spasmic contraction in your uterus. Now, first myth, staying in bed with a hot water bottle is not the answer to life. Second thing, thinking about ways to dampen down that process. So again, this is where I talk about anti-inflammatory options. So again, good nutrition here is super important. Like if you think about it, people are just told to take ibuprofen, take aspirin, whatever. That's all suppressing this pro-inflammatory process. So I would say following a really anti-inflammatory process in the build up to that is really important. Also, though, we know that there are numerous other triggers for, I guess, the overexpression of these prostaglandins. Now, stress, psychological stress is a big thing here. And I think now we are in a world, thankfully, where people do want to talk about mental health a little bit more. But I think thinking about ways that like you can support your brain, you can support yourself more from a kind of not necessarily even cognitive, but from a mindfulness perspective at this time would be important. I have some athletes who have different playlists or different podcasts that they listen to through their cycle, varying on which phase they are. So I also, even though it seems like a tenuous link, I would say considering that is also really important. Also stretching out the spasm. Like if you get cramp in your calf, what do? You stretch it out, but actually stretching this out would be important. Other things, there are some interesting bits of research going on at the moment looking at TENS machines. Don't know if you've heard of them. They cause like kind of contractions or they cause a similar contraction type process to happen, but they desensitize the tissue because actually we know that the cramping again is caused by these prostaglandins, and the pain is caused by ischemia, which is basically like a hypoxic response, so a lack of oxygen response that's happening in this area. But this rewires the brain to like dampen down the pain, which is super interesting. So yeah, there's lots of different things you can consider. I'm also not saying that don't go near a hot water bottle because for some people that does work. But I would say don't curl up in a ball in bed, get up, move, be proactive with your nutrition, think about your load, think about your mind, etc.
Yeah, I think they're just such useful tips that I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to find very helpful for themselves. And you spoke about the link between your mental health and your physical health, and the symptoms you feel physically can be linked to your mind. What about injury risk? Is there any stage of the cycle that's you're more injury prone?
Yes, that's such a good question. And actually, yesterday we published a paper, or I guess the media picked up a paper talking about injury risk across the menstrual cycle in football. I do a lot of work in football, admittedly, but that really is because it's probably the most advanced sport. There are lots of myths around injury risk and the menstrual cycle. And I think at the moment, I like to sit on a fence and say, well, we know some things and we don't know other things. As with everything in this area, we do need to learn more. What I would say is that our research in football has found that in that premenstrual phase, you're 6 times more likely to get a muscle injury than when you're on your period, which is super interesting because people often think, oh, it's when you're on your period that you get injured. People also often speculate that around ovulation, that's a time where you might be more likely to get injured as well. Now, that is because there's increased ligament laxity, which basically means that I guess your joints, even though I hate saying it like this, your joints are maybe a little bit more lax or flexible. But I would say that's much more around a contact injury. So in running, unless you're like me and like to run into things, contact injuries aren't very common. But I would just say it's often, I would hypothesize, and based on our research, which only included 26 athletes, 74 injuries, that premenstrual phase is where people are often a bit more fatigued and maybe their sleep's off and maybe they're more anxious because they've got all these other symptoms going on. I just think that's where you just need to look after your body a little bit more. The other thing I would just flag is that I think there is increasing evidence highlighting that injury flares can occur across the menstrual cycle. So say someone who historically has had a plantar fascia problem or an Achilles tendon problem, premenstrually, where there's suddenly a bit more inflammation, we know that pain sensitivity is affected a little bit, anxiety is a little bit higher. There can be like a flare. Like I know my lower back gets a bit irritated at that time, but it's all about just recognizing it, appreciating it, and knowing that, oh, in a couple of days it will be fine again. One thing I would say is that I'm working on this project at the moment where we're trying to pull all of this information together. So watch this space, but we're going to be so keen to have people to log this type of information so we can actually really conclusively say, like, this is a time where you are more likely to experience A, B, or C, but this is how you mitigate it, because there's no way we can sit here and say, don't exercise today because you might get injured. That's the worst thing. But it's all about saying, how do we train females in the right way so that there isn't this risk?
That's so fascinating. Can we just talk a bit about oral contraceptives? Because from this whole conversation so far, what I'm getting is it's so important to understand our natural hormones and track them so we can perform at our absolute peak. But presumably taking oral contraceptives would then affect those natural levels. So how does that all play in?
Yeah, good question. So hormonal contraception, full stop, changes menstrual cycle physiology, but it changes it to different extents. So there are 2 types of oral contraceptive pills. There's the combined pill, which contains both synthetic estrogen and progesterone, so we call them exogenous hormones. They suppress natural hormones, so our normal cycle with the different phases doesn't occur. You take an active pill every day for typically 21 days. Some people take it for 24 days. Then you have a placebo week or 4 days, depending on what protocol you're following and what pill type. Now, yeah, that totally changes your hormonal milieu, so like the hormonal environment. And for some people, it's really great, and there's a reason for them taking it, whether it's from a preventing pregnancy perspective or because they've got some kind of underlying menstrual problem and they've been advised to take it. So I guess that has the biggest like systemic and global effect. Now, big things to remember here when we talk about having a period, and actually a period being a good sign of health, which I'm sure we're going to come to, the having a bleed when you're taking a pill isn't the same. It isn't showing like good, everything's in a good place. It's a withdrawal bleed, it's not a period. Also, there is a myth out there that actually you don't get symptoms when you're using the pill, but actually our research suggests that you do, and other people's research suggests the same. So for sure there's a time and a place, but it's an interesting one. Then on the flip, there's progestin only options. So there's the progestin only pill, which is probably one of the most popular progestin-only options. There's also the IUD. And that gives less amount of hormone than the combined pill, and it affects hormones in a slightly different way. So natural estrogen is still produced to some extent, and it's quite common with the progestin-only pill to have more irregular bleeding, spotting, etc. Again, that's not a period. And then there's other forms as well, like there's the intrauterine device or the coil, which is what I guess the lay term for it, which is increasingly popular, and that causes less of a suppression of natural hormones. So it's quite common to still have periods, so you'd call them periods. It's quite common to still ovulate and to be in a normal cycle. So tracking that is really important. Then there's things like the implant, the injection as well.
So you saying that having a regular natural period is a good sign of health. If you are on hormonal contraception, what would you recommend to do to make sure you are still healthy? Would you recommend taking a break every now and then to see if you get a natural period? And then linked to that as well, can you actually talk us through why it is so important to have a regular period? Because I know it is a common problem in distance running for females to maybe lose their regular cycle.
Yeah, good question. So, firstly, in terms of whether you should have a break in hormonal contraception, I mean, okay, so my heart says yes, but the research says we don't really know yet. So we don't really know in terms of long-term consequences of using hormonal contraception. I just think it's so, I guess I'd flip it and say, as a practitioner working in this space, it is so useful that females have this dial or this sign of readiness, I would say. The males don't have. This is where we're ahead of the game. And we actually have this way of saying, like, the body is working well. Like, if the body's too stressed, it just shuts down and says, I can't have a child right now, I'm going to stop my periods. Simple as that. But research actually doesn't say, like, after 5 years, you should stop using the pill, have a regular cycle, or see if you're having regular cycles, etc. But there are lots of tips and tricks that you can ensure that you're doing to look after yourself. And I would also say they very much coincide with tips to having a regular cycle. So thinking about fueling regularly. So like I said before, females shouldn't exercise fasted, but females also should fuel regularly and typically every 2 to 3 hours. And that should include carbs and protein. Also ensuring obviously that you're eating enough is really important, and enough of the right things. But it's interesting because I think we get so het up on fueling that we forget the other reasons why someone might not have a regular cycle. So like stress is such an important one here. And I think, again, in line with people talking more about mental health, I think increasingly we're seeing the effects of cortisol, the stress hormone or primary stress hormone, on the reproductive axis and how it can just shut it down. So making sure you're looking after yourself mentally, but also making sure you're not overtraining, you're not overloaded. And there are things that if you are using the combined forms of hormonal contraception, you can get regular blood tests to ensure that your white cells are looking good, your immune function is good, your iron status is good, and numerous other markers are in a good place, just to have a few extra tick boxes of, yes, okay, this is good. In terms of why is it important to have a regular cycle, like firstly, we know that estrogen and progesterone are actually really good for whole body health. So estrogen is important for bone health, it's important for brain health, heart health, recovery. It's a super important positive hormone, and actually progesterone is often demonized, but it's actually a very good like stabilizing hormone. And again, like this menstrual cycle is that dial for females that shows, yes, okay, things are good. So really, from a practitioner perspective, again, it is useful to know that someone has a regular cycle, and as an athlete, I think it's a really useful additional tool that you have as a female.
What about iron deficiency? Can we just dig into a bit about that? And what do we need to know about monitoring our iron levels and making sure they're all in check?
Okay, so first thing is, athletes generally are more likely to be iron deficient than non-athletes. So we know that pounding the ground or like putting impact through the ground can cause this thing called hemolysis, which is the breakdown of like red blood cells, which causes iron to be lost. We also know that iron is lost in sweat. So for those of you who sweat a lot, you need to remember that. We also know that iron can be lost through this process called hematuria, which is basically the impact from like landing, jumping, running within your body again can cause this breakdown of tissue, which then causes iron to be lost. And then females as well, we know that obviously females menstruate typically, so that causes more iron losses in addition. So in essence, exercising females, and particularly those who are loading their body, are more susceptible to iron deficiency than the general population. We also know that measuring iron status is really challenging. So as I alluded to earlier, ferritin is typically used as this way to gauge iron status. Now, ferritin isn't actually iron. Ferritin is a cage that houses iron that's expressed differently based on the amount of iron in your body. There's actually a few different compartments within the body where iron is stored. So some is stored just in blood, some is stored within the liver, some is stored within other cells, some is stored in cages with ferritin or as ferritin. as a part of ferritin, I guess. So actually, when we talk about our iron status and everyone goes on about my ferritin's this and my ferritin's that, or my iron is this or that, it really is only telling a small part of the story. So big thing I would say is that firstly, we know iron is super, super important for, firstly, like it helps with red blood cell like development and the number of red blood cells. If you don't have enough iron, you won't be able to make as many red blood cells, and red blood cells are really important for aerobic capacity. So actually it helps transport oxygen around the body. There's also lots of other functions that iron, or lots of other roles in the body that iron plays. So it really helps with cognition as well, for example. But there is definitely a balance here. Having too much iron is also dangerous. So iron is toxic. So you don't want it, and I don't want to make everyone really scared here, but there's definitely a sweet spot with iron. So we often talk about making sure that you're getting enough iron sources in your diet as a priority over suddenly taking loads of supplementation. And also if you're told to supplementing strategically is also key. Like it's very much a less is more with iron generally. And again, refer to your medical practitioner. Hopefully they will have the answers around how much you individually should be having. But I guess one big kind of conclusive thing here is that don't just focus on ferritin, think about other measures as well. So there's like transferrin saturation, there's serum iron, there's total iron binding capacity, which all really come together. And this was a big thing of my PhD. They all should be considered in light of each other. Another thing just to have in the back of your mind is that we know that iron status fluctuates through the menstrual cycle as well. So just to add to the fun and games of the complexity of iron, it's not as simple as just on any one day you have a blood test and this is what it shows. So I think really understanding yourself and tracking over time, I would say for people really trying to understand their baselines is key, and consider where you are in your menstrual cycle.
What are the symptoms of having too low iron or too much as well?
Well, so iron deficiency is slow and insidious, we call it. So it kind of creeps up on you and bites you in the bum because you don't really know until then suddenly you're in a hole. Big things are like not recovering well, often being a bit restless actually, and just being fatigued generally, a bit of brain fog as well. Now, and I think when it gets worse and worse, it can cause anemia. So typically iron deficiency starts as iron deficiency non-anemia, so it's not affecting your red blood cell production, but as it progresses it can become anemia, which means that you're not producing as many red blood cells. So that can cause you to feel a bit breathless. You might feel in training you're just not able to capitalize on the training that you're doing. So I would say they're kind of the main signs, but I really think it's actually iron deficiency is the most bizarre thing, because you can start experiencing some weird cravings, like for ice, for example, for salt, for dirt even. There's this thing called pica where people start getting weird cravings. I remember one of my uni friends would just eat ice out of the fridge and we'd be like, what is she doing? Which was just really iron deficient. It's crazy. On the flip though, having too much is often really, people just totally aren't aware of this. And so like in terms of key signs, like fatigue is one of them for sure, but other than that is often that people just don't know, and then they'll go and have a blood test and then suddenly it'll be like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. So I think just being like super careful with it. Another one I just wanted to mention in terms of being low in iron is just potentially getting ill more regularly. So again, just thinking about that.
How frequently should we test our iron levels,
Yeah.
Ideally,
I would say probably 3 times a year, so maybe every 4 months. If though you do have like negative findings, so your iron is like pretty poor, I would say following a supplementation protocol and then testing again would be important. But it can take 3 to 6 months of supplementation to like restore your iron status. And it's really important to not just take iron supplements and to think about nutrition alongside it as well.
And is there any specific stage of you mentioned iron levels naturally fluctuate throughout the menstrual cycle, so should we be testing at the same time each time
if you
we
can
test?
That would be golden. Yeah. The time where you're most likely to have like low iron stores is when you're on your period or just finished your period.
Wow, there is just so much to dig into, isn't it? I feel like we have just scratched the surface here. But so many incredible takeaway tips. I mean, I feel like I've learned an incredible amount and now want to go and find out even more. But to wrap things up, a question we ask all our listeners is, what is your high five me moment? So a moment that can be in running or all of your other work that you would just give yourself a massive high five?
For me, there's two things. I think in my work world, I feel like I get a real buzz out of like publishing work that's meaningful with take homes. Like a lot of people out there love to work in a lab and, you know, do research on rats maybe. And well, that's really interesting. But for me, it's about actually how can that impact the world and like how can we translate this to reality? So probably like publishing something that is like impactful. So for example, like our injury research that we published yesterday, like I'm excited by it, but at the same time, I feel like what next? So what can people do about it? So that's one thing. And then I guess from a running perspective, like there's just nothing better than just feeling like you and enjoying like a race or enjoying something that you're doing. I think we all have days where sometimes it's just a grind, but when you're just like, I'm feeling good, I feel like, you know, I'm just like flying over the ground. I feel like whether it's in a race or in training, that would be like my favorite thing.
Yeah,
I love that.
They are great moments and you are definitely impacting the world. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us for 5 Miles Easy.
See you next time.